Hi, this is Seriously Good News. I'm Ed Sims, and today I'm looking at a parable of Jesus. It's found in the 13th chapter of Matthew, and it begins with verse 24 through 30, and then Jesus gives an explanation of the parable in verses 36 to 43. So here it is. He put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in his field, but while everyone was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and then went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared as well. And the slaves of the householder came to him and said, Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Where then did these weeds come from? He answered, An enemy has done this. The slave said to him, "Then do you want us to go and gather them?" But he replied, "No, for in gathering the weeds you would uproot the wheat along with them. Let both of them grow together until the harvest, and at harvest time I'll tell the reapers, collect the weeds first, bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn." Then he left the crowds and went into the house. And his disciples approached him, saying, "Explain to us the parable of the weeds of the field." He answered, "The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, the good seed are the children of the kingdom, the weeds are the children of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is at the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. Just as the weeds are collected and burned up with fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels. They will collect out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all evildoers, and they will throw them into the furnace of fire where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Let anyone with ears listen. This is the second of 7 parables that Jesus told about the kingdom of heaven. It's also the second one he takes the time to explain to his disciples. He's describing what things will be like when God comes to truly rule in our hearts and lives. To do so, he's using examples from everyday life in his homeland and his culture, things people would understand. The story is about wheat and weeds. The weeds, called tares in my older Bible translation, were most likely a plant called false darnel. False darnel starts out looking pretty much the same as sprouting wheat. It's only when the wheat and weeds come to maturity that you can tell the difference. False darnel is not something that you want invading your crop. The seeds are toxic. They cause dizziness and nausea. Ingesting enough of them can be fatal. So it's a serious matter when the weeds are discovered growing with the wheat. The farmer in the parable could stand to lose his entire crop. You can feel the tension as the field hand comes to tell the farmer, someone has sown weeds in your wheat. For someone to have done this, it must have been 1, intentional, and 2, malicious. The farmer observes, an enemy has done this. I may not understand a lot about wheat farming or thinning out false darnel, but I do have some experience fighting weeds, and I confess that I know the anger and frustration that comes from feeling like you have an enemy. So let's talk about weeds. I'm not very good at weeding. There are a couple of areas in our yard where it looks like I'm intentionally growing weeds. Some of the worst are honeysuckle, Virginia creeper, and worst of all, wisteria. I have a love-hate relationship with wisteria. I love the way it smells. I love the way the flowers look. I would like to enjoy them from a distance in somebody else's yard. We had neighbors at the lake who are gone now, thank goodness. Our neighbors now are great, and I give thanks for them. A couple who lived next to us before they moved away had a son who robbed our house. They had vicious dogs who jumped over the fence separating our properties and attacked Amelia and my son Theo and our dog Yuki. But in a parable of what goes around comes around, they ended up getting involved with drugs and divorcing, and the wife left, and the husband remarried and moved to Italy, and the dogs are all shipped off somewhere to Georgia, I think. Good riddance to bad dogs, is all I can say. I think I've forgiven them. And when I think about it, maybe them being gone to other places ended up being a good thing for them. Hope so. At least I don't think about them much anymore. Well, at least until I started putting together this message. I never really thought about them as enemies, though. In spite of the wisteria, they had an oak tree that was covered with it. Every year we were treated to a beautiful and fragrant set of purple flowers, and runners traveled right underground into our yard, climbed up and choked our azaleas, our dogwoods, our crepe myrtles. And when the bad neighbors moved away, good neighbors bought the property and they cut down the wisteria filled oak tree. But now, even years later, we are still fighting runners that creep up from the roots next door. It feels like a never ending battle. At least I don't. I don't believe the bad neighbors planted the wisteria on purpose, knowing how much of a perpetual pain it would be. In Jesus' parable, the farmer is pretty certain that if false darnel has been introduced into his wheat crop, it must have been done by an enemy. It was someone who intentionally and maliciously intended for the farmer and his family either to have become poisoned or to have experienced economic disaster resulting from the failure of their crop. So, what does the parable tell us today? And what does it say about what life is and what it can be like in the kingdom of God when it is ruling in our hearts? To begin with, Jesus is saying there is evil in this world. The enemy is present and real. That's pretty clear. The question is, how do we, as God's people and followers of Jesus, respond to that evil? Jesus seems to be calling us to reflect rather than react, and to be willing to give ultimate authority of judgment to God, because only God has the big picture, and God has the power to change hearts and lives. In Jesus' story, the farmer exclaims, "An enemy has done this." In Jesus' explanation of the story, he points out that the enemy who sowed the wheat is the devil. Evil is real. Was then, it is now. There are good people and there are bad people. Evil in people is characterized by lying and deceit, by self-centeredness, which of course is sin, and by an absence of compassion for others, particularly others who are weaker or are more vulnerable. This is a reality of our life. Now, I think God desires all of God's children to be good, and I want to believe that there's some good in everyone. I believe that we're created in the image of God, and that is good. God said that clearly in the creation stories. At the same time, I believe that sin distorts the image of God within us. Sin often manifests as self centeredness. It leads us to make bad decisions. The more bad decisions you make, the easier it becomes to make them. With each bad decision, God's image is being further and further distorted. I believe that it is possible that a person can distort God's image to the point where their heart is literally given over to evil. The question then becomes, how do we, as God's people and followers of Jesus, deal with the evil that surrounds us? Because here's the problem. It's often difficult for us to tell the difference between good people and bad people. We like to think that we can recognize evil, at least absolute evil, but our own brokenness, our own past experience, our own situation in life can sometimes make discernment difficult. That's why Jesus' teachings about judging others are so emphatic. He's very clear on this. He says, don't judge others. The measure that you use to judge others will be used in your own judgment before God. Don't try to pick the speck out of someone else's eye when you have a log in your own eye. This is an extremely hard teaching for me, because I also believe that God has given me the gift of spiritual discernment. That is, when we're following Jesus, we believe that he somehow clears up our vision so that we can tell the difference between good and evil. And yet, Jesus instructs us to suspend judgment. Why? I think it's because we tend more toward knee jerk reaction as opposed to mature spiritual reflection. That is, in fact, what the farmhand in Jesus' parable did. He exclaims, "Do you want us to root all the weeds up?" Yet the farmer counsels, "Let both grow together. They can be separated at harvest time," which Jesus explains is the end of time. My first tendency is to react. My natural tendency is to be judgmental. When I do these things, I'm rarely at my best as a mature spiritual person. I clearly have spiritual work to be done. There are actually physiological reasons for knee jerk reactions. Knee jerk reactions originate in the most primitive part of the brain, the part we might call the reptilian or lizard brain. Scientists call it the limbic system. It's the area of our brain that controls our fight or flight response. Now, if I'm being attacked by a bear, this is a very good part of the brain to use. If I'm in a meeting at work or at school or at church and someone steps on my toes, or if I'm on social media and someone posts something really vile and hateful, the limbic system is less useful. In fact, in our life together, knee jerk reactions will tend to make things worse rather than they were than to make them better. In the parable, notice that the farmer is not ignoring the problem. He will ultimately separate the weeds from the wheat, but he's not going to fly off the handle and make things worse. Bishop Wallace Paget once once said that a primary guiding principle of the North Alabama Conference of the United Methodist Church is not to react, but to reflect and then to respond. What she meant by that is that as a church, we're called into a life of reflective action as opposed to reflex action. We are called to pray, to study scripture, and to dialogue with one another as we seek the best, most Christ like course of action. Reflective responding gets you out of the lizard brain and into the reasoning brain. That's why we sometimes say that you need to stop and take a deep breath and maybe even count to 10 before responding to something. Of course, that's a lot easier said than done. As a matter of fact, it's much more difficult to respond reflectively than to react reflexively. It takes determination and self control to maintain what my former counselor calls a calm, non anxious presence, especially in the midst of conflict filled situations, which, by the way, today seems to be almost all situations. This practice, being a non anxious presence, is actually a part of our mission as followers of Jesus. Remember that mission? Bring healing, make peace, point out the presence of God. Responding reflectively rather than reacting to a situation helps to fulfill that mission and gives God the chance to do the judging and the chance to work out God's ultimate plan in our midst. There are three reasons why this is a good idea. First, only God has the big picture. I simply do not have God's perspective. Ever hear someone say, "You can't see the forest for the trees"? We simply don't have God's perspective. God knows how things will turn out. God knows the big picture. I don't. When I react and judge others, I do so out of my own sin distorted, self centered perspective. Second, only God knows a person's heart. That's why Jesus counsels such gentleness in dealing with others. I simply don't know all the hurt and brokenness that a person carries with them. Even when I understand that the hurt and brokenness is shaping the way that person is acting, so is a person good but broken? Or have they deliberately given themselves over to evil and deliberate badness? Only God knows. I may judge them wrongly, and in doing so, judge myself. That's why the farmer does not say, "It's obviously my jealous neighbor. Hurry, go and kill him, or at least poison his field." Finally, God can transform even the hardest of hearts. The same God who can transform water into wine can transform a bad person into a good person. Look at John Newton of Amazing Grace fame. Look at Charles Colson of Watergate fame. God changes hearts. The same God who can bring forth fishes and loaves to feed thousands can bring forth righteous acts from a distorted and broken child of God. To put it in parable terms, God could transform even false darnel into wheat. I believe this is true. I hope this is true because that means that God could transform even me and you. What does all this mean? Leave judgment to God. Think about what this story has taught us. Know that evil is real. It is often difficult to discern the broken from the bad. We can learn to respond reflectively instead of reacting reflexively. And it's always best to leave judgment to God. This is some pretty good advice for living together as God's people. I'll finish by saying that it's important to hear and follow Jesus' teachings for two more reasons. Our children and our grandchildren are watching us, and non followers of Jesus are also watching us. What we do matters. Remember the parable of the sower? We have the potential to sow tremendous good into our world. God willing, that's what we'll do. God bless you. I'll see you next time.